It's my pleasure tonight to introduce our third speaker, Professor Michael Siegal. Dr. Siegal is a professor in the Department of Community Health Sciences at the Boston University School of Public Health. During his 22 years at the school, his main areas of research interest have been alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. And what ties these issues together is the presence of powerful corporations that use sophisticated marketing, public relations, and lobbying activities to make a negative impact on public health. His current work focuses on examining the impact of state firearm laws on rates of firearm-related homicide and suicide, studying the role of gun culture in the epidemic of firearms violence, and exploring the effects of state-level firearm laws on homicide rates among African American and Hispanic populations. Please join me in welcoming Professor Siegal.
Thank you very much. You guys have all been led to believe that there is a huge gridlock in the firearms policy debate, that there are two sides to this issue that are completely irreconcilable, and that there really is no common ground between them. How can you have the NRA, who basically is opposed to every possible piece of legislation that would protect people from firearm violence, and have any common ground between that group and, on the other hand, some public health practitioners who are so zealous against guns that they essentially want to eliminate guns completely? And there have been communities in which the legislatures have banned all handguns in the entire city. How can you have these two diametrically opposed sides? And with a very polarized government now, with Democrats and Republicans not able to agree on anything, how can we ever have common ground in this debate? And you know what? It's all wrong. That's all wrong. When I got into this field 5 years ago, started working in firearms research, this is what I thought. I thought this is an impasse here, there's gridlock, we're not gonna get anywhere. And I've come to realize that that's a myth, that they're fooling us into thinking that that's the case. And the truth is, there is complete common ground. And let me explain why. So to understand that, we have to start with talking a little bit about the healthcare debate, and specifically talking about Obamacare. Remember, Obamacare was enacted by Congress in 2010. So I want to give you some quotes by politicians about Obamacare, and I want you to try to figure out, from your knowledge of politicians, who do you think said these quotes, okay? So the first one is, quote, "If we do not act, there will be counties in the United States where some of the most vulnerable Americans will have zero insurance." Okay, so think about a politician. Can you think of a politician who would express extreme concern over the fact that there are very vulnerable people in our society who may not have access to health insurance? Who fits that description? Here's another quote. "We're going to continue to do everything," oops, sorry, I think I skipped one. "We have no portability today. You can't take your insurance policy with you across job and geographic change. When I change jobs, I don't lose my life insurance. Everybody in this body wants every American to have health insurance." So who could this be? What political figure can you think of that it would express concern about the importance of every single American having health insurance? And third, here's another quote. "We're going to continue to do everything in our power to protect people with pre-existing conditions so that they are not afraid about changing jobs and being excluded from their new employer's insurance coverage." What politician can you think of would have said this, would have expressed a concern that people might be denied, because of their pre-existing conditions, from obtaining health insurance? Here are your choices. Do you think that was A, former President Barack Obama? Was it B, former Senator Hillary Clinton? Do you think that was C, the Senate Democratic leadership? And I'm not going to ask you the specific names. Or D, the House Democratic leadership? Well, let's take a look. If we do not act, there will be counties in the United States where some of the most vulnerable Americans will have zero insurance options. Who said that? None other than Senator Lamar Alexander, a Republican from Tennessee. And who said everybody in this body wants every American to have health insurance? Of course, it was Senator Ben Sasse, a Republican from Nebraska. And who said we're going to continue to do everything in our power to protect people with pre-existing conditions so that they're not afraid about changing jobs and being excluded from their new employer's insurance coverage? That was Senator John Cornyn, a Republican from the state of Texas. So how is this possible? How can we have these incredible statements, more powerful than anything I've ever heard a Democrat say about the Affordable Care Act, now being said by Republicans? And the answer is that this is not 2010. These are quotes from 2017. And there's been a drastic change in the way that this issue has been framed from 2010 to 2017. In 2010, we were talking about giving people something. The people who didn't have insurance, we were going to give them insurance. But in 2017, the debate is about something very different. It's about taking away health insurance from people who already have it. And that's the reason why healthcare has not been successfully repealed. It's not that anyone's changed their mind. It's not that the basic principles are different. It's that the frame is different. We've been led to believe that there is such a thing as public opinion. And I want to suggest to you tonight that that is a myth. There is no such thing as public opinion. For example, public opinion about same-sex marriage. So here's some data from the Gallup poll. In 2009, 40% of Americans, when they were asked the question, should the government allow same-sex marriage, 40% said yes. In 2017, 64% said yes. So it looks from this, you would naturally conclude, you don't need any fancy statistics, to conclude that there's been this huge change in public opinion from 2009 to 2017. Well, that's not the full story. In a little-known Gallup poll, which was done also in 2009, the American people were asked a slightly different question, worded slightly different. They were asked, does the government have the right to prohibit marriage between two people of the same sex? And 63% of Americans said no, absolutely not. So the reality is that in 2009, 63%, these 63% of Americans actually supported same-sex marriage. They did not believe that the government had the right to come in and tell a couple of the same sex that they were not allowed to marry. Reality is, no, it didn't go from 40% to 64%. It stayed the same. It was already at 63%. So what changed? What changed was not public opinion. What changed was not people's attitudes. What changed was not people's values. What changed was the way this issue was framed in the public discourse. We came to see it by 2017 as an issue of taking something away from people, taking away their right to be a family, to have a family. It's not public opinion that changed, it's the way the issue was framed. What public opinion actually measures is simply what frame is most effective in capturing the mind of the public. And this is not a coincidence. There is very careful planning that's done by the different sides in the debate to try to figure out what those frames are and to craft those frames to get you to agree with them, to show you that whatever your opinions and attitudes are, that they would support their side. So let's go back, before Obamacare was passed, let's go back to 2009. This is a survey I received in the mail from the Republican National Committee. And they asked the question, number 10, do you believe the federal government should take over America's healthcare system? So the purpose of this survey was that the Republican National Committee was trying to figure out, how should we frame this issue? What's the best way that we should frame this issue? They didn't care about public opinion. They didn't ask, what is your opinion about people having health insurance? They weren't interested in your actual public opinion. They were interested in, how can I frame this issue to rile people up and get them against this proposal? And they got their answer. Tell them that this is a federal takeover of America's healthcare system. In other words, call it Obamacare. And that's where Obamacare came from. Obamacare was created not in 2010, it was created in 2009. The Republicans had already decided what was going to be effective. The Democrats did the same thing, and they asked questions like, should every American be guaranteed access to affordable health care? Should Congress extend health care coverage to low-income Americans who can't afford health insurance? You can already see why their frames lost, why their frames were far less effective. Because they're talking about things like, should we extend health care to everybody? That's not a particularly strong value when you compare it to the frame of, this is a government takeover. Now we can talk about the gridlock and the firearms debate. So I want to show you some quotes from one of the sides. These are all from one of the sides in the debate. And I want you to try to figure out what organization made these statements. So the first quote, people who are far more likely to misuse a gun than the average citizen should not be able to get a gun. Okay, that's a very strong statement. If you are just a little bit more likely than the average citizen to misuse a gun, you should not be able to get one. Who would have said that? What organization? What organization would have said that citizens with a felony conviction should be prevented from acquiring a gun? No questions asked. What organization would have said plainly, criminals who use firearms in the commission of their crimes do not give up their guns simply because it's illegal for them to have one? In other words, you can't just ban the possession of guns, you have to actually take them away from people. What organization said, losing some freedoms along the margins is a risk that's worth taking to protect the public from what they see as preventable violence? And what organization boasted that we led a successful effort to require the federal government to set up a computerized system that would allow almost instantaneous background checks. And when the government dragged its feet on that system, this organization pushed to get background checks up and running. So here are your choices. Was it the Brady campaign to prevent gun violence? Was it Moms Demand Action on Gun Violence? Was it Everytown to Prevent Gun Violence, which is Mayor Bloomberg's campaign? Or was it Americans for Responsible Solutions, which is Gabby Gifford's organization? And the answer is, every single one of these quotes came from the same organization, which was the National Rifle Association. In fact, the NRA has expressed two basic principles. The first is that, and this is from the former president of the NRA, quote, the question is how to narrow the criteria in a way that will both protect society and respect those whose rights would be affected by unfairly including them on a list that denies people their constitutional rights. In other words, the principle is, how do we draw the line so that we can keep guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them without infringing on constitutional rights to own a gun? And the second principle, quote, we should find ways to help individuals who can be shown to be potentially dangerous based on their past activities or mental problems, and to devise ways to limit their access to firearms without impinging on their due process rights. So those two principles turn out to be not just the NRA's principles, but those are my principles. I've come to the conclusion that those two principles are the principles that we need to follow if we're going to solve the problem of firearm violence. There's two things we need to do. We need to prevent at-risk persons from acquiring firearms, And that's done with background checks, something which the NRA supports and something which the NRA actually implemented. And secondly, we have to prevent at-risk persons from using firearms that they already have. Again, that's something that the NRA specifically stated was one of its principles. And so, in reality, because of the way these issues have been framed, the only legitimate public policy question, the only real debate here, is just exactly where we draw that line. Both sides essentially agree on the principles. With effective regulation, we can actually make it easier for law-abiding citizens to obtain guns. Why is that? Well, why is that when you go to the airport, an 80-year-old woman has to take off her shoes and get a pat-down? Why does she have to give up that freedom of access to a plane without being basically strip searched? The reason she has to give that up is very simple. It's because we don't have effective mechanisms to identify people who are most at risk of committing terrorism. If we did, then we could leave her alone and let her board the plane in peace and comfort. And it's the same thing with firearm violence. The reason why we are impeding on people's constitutional rights is because we don't have an effective way of identifying people who are at highest risk. And if we did, if we could identify those people who are at highest risk and effectively prevent them from accessing firearms, we could solve this problem in a way that actually enhances access for the law-abiding citizen. And so the greatest myth in the firearm debate is that firearm regulation and the Second Amendment are in opposition. The truth is that the Second Amendment and responsible firearm regulation are not mutually exclusive, and that in fact, effective regulation of firearms would actually help to reinforce the Second Amendment and its ability to protect citizens' rights to possess firearms. And that's the myth that you're going to hear from the NRA. Thank you. So are there a couple of questions? Yeah, we have a couple in the middle here.
Hi. So how would you suggest for like the most staunch supporters for gun control in Congress and the government, things like that, how would you suggest that they instead frame the issue to turn public support more towards common sense gun control?
So I think that what we need to do really is start where they are. Start with their own language. Start with their own statements. Start with their own principles. If I were trying to convince them, what I would do is start with the NRA's very own statements. And start with, let's sit down and let's talk about what are the principles that we all agree on. And once we agree on those principles, we can see where that takes us. But from my research, what is very clear is that once we agree on those principles, which everyone agrees on, including the NRA, which is that people who are at high risk should not have access to firearms. Everyone agrees with that. And everyone also agrees that people who are at low risk, who are law-abiding citizens, should not have their rights to possess firearms impeded in any way. And I would go further, and I would say that we should make it as easy as possible. There should be no unnecessary infringements on those people. And so we have something to offer that's currently not being offered to that side, which is we're willing to make it easier for you to access firearms, as long as we can find an effective way of identifying the people who are at most risk, at highest risk. And there are ways to do that, and in fact, my research is designed or is working on that. Just yesterday, I had a paper published in the Annals of Internal Medicine which showed that if you take people who are subject to restraining orders, domestic violence restraining orders, and you take away their guns, you reduce intimate partner homicides by 14%. Domestic violence is, I think, the most sensitive indicator of future violence. There is almost no violent offender that has ever committed significant violence who did not first exhibit that violence and an intimate partner relationship. And so if we intervene in that setting, which everybody agrees, there was another quote here I could have showed you from the NRA where they say domestic violence is absolutely terrible and nobody who commits that should have a gun. Everyone agrees on that. If we just implemented that, exactly what the NRA is saying, we could have a huge decline in firearm violence immediately. So I would go right to those principles. I would ask them to elucidate, articulate what the principles are, and then we can just take it from those principles.
Hi, thank you for your talk. You talked about a lot of very controversial issues that are especially controversial nowadays with the division in our country politically. And I know you backed them up with many statistics. For example, the quote from the NRA. How do you suggest that we as a society can become more open-minded in fighting these stereotypes? For example, that the NRA is pro-gun violence and that all Democrats want to confiscate weapons. How can we change those stereotypes?
Well, thank you. That's a really fantastic question. I think there need to be changes on both sides. I think that there's rhetoric on both sides that's simply not true. And so I urge all of you to actually read the statements that are being made by both sides. If you read this book, after you finish Ulysses, you'll be prepared for shall not be infringed, the new assaults on your Second Amendment, written by David Keene, former president of the NRA. You should really read that book because I want you to actually see what the NRA says. And it's not scary. It's actually not scary. What they actually say makes a lot of sense. On the other hand, there's a lot of rhetoric from the other side, and I'll admit it's from the public health side, that I think is going too far and that shows, I think, a misunderstanding of what gun ownership is about and about the cultural role that it plays. Many of my colleagues say things like, we need to get rid of guns. They say things like, gun owners are the problem. They say things like, gun owners are irresponsible. If only we could stop those irresponsible gun owners. If only we could get guns out of their hands. And they fail to understand the social symbol that guns represent in our society. They're not, guns for most people who own them are not simply implements. They're symbols. And what their symbols are is symbols of freedom. They're symbols of freedom and empowerment. And unless we start recognizing that and treating gun owners and respecting gun owners as citizens who are legitimately trying to feel a sense of freedom, then we're going to continue alienating both sides. I think that there's a real opportunity to bring gun owners into the public health side, because when you look at the statistics, if you believe, quote, public opinion, which hopefully you know now, there is no such thing. But when you ask gun owners, do you support background checks? Do you support the kind of laws that I talked about before with domestic violence? They all say yes. It's an overwhelming majority. And so the actual values and principles that the gun owners have are perfectly conducive to sensible gun regulation. But I think your point is very well taken. There needs to be give and take on both sides. And especially on our side, in terms of public health, we need to really start recognizing that there are very legitimate reasons why people own guns. They represent very deep values in American society, and we're not going to be able to engage in a conversation with gun owners until we show them that we actually respect them and their decisions. Yeah, there's a couple back there.
So my question is, a couple of years ago in Texas, I believe they started allowing, they passed a law that allows people to bring firearms into like places of education, like college campuses, maybe even like high schools. I'm not sure about that part, but I know for sure college campuses. And so I understand that guns represent freedom to people, but why fight so hard to, like, at a certain point, I feel like you're really pushing it when you're saying, oh no, like I need to be able to carry my gun into a college? Why do you need to carry your gun into a college campus when it makes other people feel uncomfortable? So where's that line drawn where it's like we have to respect them? And I don't think anyone truly says that, all gun owners don't know how to handle their guns. I think most people are trying to say is that, like what you're saying, we need to regulate. Not everyone should be allowed to own a gun. So what do you think about things like citizens fighting for their ability to have guns in places that a lot of people don't think there needs to be a gun?
So that's a great question. And I think that this is another area where I think that the NRA has framed the debate in a way that's simply not true. The NRA has convinced its membership that Obama, Clinton, other Democrats, Mayor Bloomberg, are out to take their weapons away from them. They've used fear to basically convince them that if they don't act, if they don't support the NRA, their weapons are going to be taken away. And therefore, we cannot allow any regulation whatsoever because it's a slippery slope. Today, they're banning carrying a gun in a college. Tomorrow, they're going to take away all your guns. And obviously, it's a completely fallacious argument. We're not going to do that. We can't do it if we wanted to because we have the Second Amendment and the Heller decision. But the problem is that I think advocates for gun control have not done a good enough job of making their intentions clear. And I think we have to start speaking a different language. The language that I'm speaking here tonight is a very different language than I have ever spoken before in front of my public health colleagues. In fact, I'm afraid if I gave this talk to my public health colleagues, a lot of them would get upset and would be wondering, what's going on with this guy? Has the NRA gotten to him? He's using the same tactics and the same phrases of the NRA. Well, but that's what we have to do. We have to speak the same language. And I think when we speak that same language, we will be able to convince the public that it just doesn't make sense. And once we can do that, and once they understand that we respect the rights of gun owners, then the NRA's pleas will fall on deaf ears. Because right now people are scared, and that's why they're successful. If we can stop that fear, then their pleas will be falling on deaf ears. But the only way to stop that fear is for us to adopt the rhetoric and the language of understanding and respect. Because when people are not respected, that's when they're fearful. Thank you. So I think that's it for the questions, but I will be staying here. I know there's probably a lot more, so I will be happy to talk to you afterwards in the reception. Thanks very much.